I'm glad you came back. Welcome to Drawing Through History. Today we'll talk about George Washington, the United States' first president. George Washington was born on February 22, 1732. He had 9 siblings: Butler, Lawrence, Austin, Jane, Mary, Betty, Samuel, John, and Charles. His mother was always worried for his safety. This made George's life not as exciting as he wanted. So he wasn't jumping through fire-lit hoops, he was just playing in the woods. One of the stories his mother told, so he would be careful, was one night she invited the neighbors over for dinner, and there was a thunderstorm. The girl from next door was sitting at the dinner table and was struck by lightning. Speaking of visiting, George's two oldest siblings, Lawrence and Austin, had never came back from school in England until George was 6. George lived in Virginia his entire childhood. He saw lots of army ships come in from the harbor. This made George exceedingly happy when his brothers came home with an army uniform. Lawrence and Austin were always gone in the army. When he was 11, his father died. This made his mother go into a mental breakdown. George wanted to go to school and be in the army. Oh, that dream never happened after his father died. His mother was still officially in charge of him, and she really wanted him to take up farming and stay home with her. George took every chance to escape to the estate of his favorite sibling, Lawrence's house. He tried everything, but his mom wouldn't let him go to school. As he got older, he studied surveying from books from the library. His neighbor had bought a lot of land in the Shenandoah Valley. He asked George if he had any knowledge in surveying land. George immediately asked his mother if he could go. She agreed. I think that's because she said yes, just because he was 16 now. He was very happy to go, though part of the way at the job he got sick with smallpox. But because he was the United States' first president, George was the first president of the United States, I think we can all figure that he lived. George's brother died, and that threw a big stone in his life, but he moved past quickly and found a job being a messenger that he could take. The British needed someone to send a message to the French in the Ohio Valley. This message was basically like, "Hey, you French, get off our land front now." George gave the message and they declined. Couldn't England see that coming? Anyway, George was sensible and got out of their land right away. He was exhausted when he got back. He had been gone for 11 weeks. So the British sent 300 soldiers to say, France, we weren't kidding when we said, please go. George was in charge of these men. He was commanded to attack any Frenchmen he saw. He was told by one of his men that they had spotted a group of French soldiers sleeping. George thought, I can attack them now and kill them all. Then England will be very happy with me. It turned out after he killed almost everyone, the prisoners they had captured told George that they had just killed the French ambassador. Good job, Mr. Washington. You just started the French and Indian War. George was kicked out of the army, so he went back to farming. He started farming tobacco. Though an opportunity came up for George to get back to the battlefield, because now there was a war England had to fight. George jumped through hoops and found a job that would help him the rest of his life. He got to be an assistant of one of the best generals in all of the British Army. This was a very popular job to apply for, and George wasn't the most amazing soldier applying. One thing, though, George said he was okay without was a salary. That made the general pretty happy, so he hired him right away. This would help him a lot now because George Washington was learning tons of British war tactics. When he got a job break one time, he was visiting his good friend. When Martha Custis, a widow staying in his friend's house, came back to ask something before either of them knew it, they were talking about their similarities. A week later, George and Martha were engaged. The Stamp Act was administered in 1765. This act made it so all paper products were taxed. This was called the Stamp Act because stamps were the taxed most. The tax for one stamp was a week's pay for a farm manager. The taxes were so huge because England needed money for the war George had started. Many people in the colonies were saying, no taxation without representation. That meant, hey England, not a single person from the colonies said we agreed to this tax. England said, okay, we'll get rid of it, but then we'll replace it with another tax called the Declaratory Act. This act made it so if you didn't pay your taxes, then you would be killed. George was exceedingly angry at this act more than the Stamp Act. George met with Thomas Jefferson and Patrick Henry. They kicked the governor out and started the Virginia boycott. A boycott is when you don't buy anything from a country. In this case, it was England. The Boston Massacre happened, and the American Revolution started. England took away all the crazy taxes except for the tea tax. George thought this wasn't fair. Britain needs money from George thought this was fair. Britain needed money from somewhere, but the other revolutionists didn't agree, so they started the Tea Party. George set off for the First Continental Congress. The First Continental Congress was held. Every single colony came except Georgia. The first meeting had many things happen. First, they made the Declaration of Rights that put a ban on all British goods. At the meeting, Patrick Henry gave his very famous speech, "Give me liberty or give me death." After many meetings, they all decided that they needed to fight the British, and the first person that everyone thought of to lead this army was George Washington. George didn't care. He was just happy to fight for his country. He was welcomed into his office of power with America's first win. As soon as George was getting ready for another battle, he got a letter saying that people had torn down the statue of the king and the coat of arms. That made George feel like the colonies were coming together. One of the most famous stories of how George was smarter than the British was that George and the English were setting up for the night in an opening in the forest. Well, George told his men to make a huge wall and then to make fire pits behind it. You ask why? Well, the British saw the smoke from the fires and thought, they're going to bed. We should too. Good night. George was doing the opposite of what they thought. He went into the forest, and in the morning George's army said "surprise" to the British in the morning from behind. He attacked and won. Later in the war, George was waiting for a general from France. He was expecting a man his age, very experienced in the army, strong and helpful. He wasn't happy when the general he was given was 19. George Washington thought, "Congress is making me babysit this child." His name was Lafayette, my personal favorite character from history. He put Lafayette in the back of his mind and focused on winning a battle so the French would help America in its war. He had just lost a battle, and he wasn't in a very happy mood. George kind of started enjoying Lafayette's company a little bit more. Lafayette told the French that they should help George out, so the French joined happily so that they could annoy the British. George was overwhelmed with joy, but with happiness comes sorrow. Ugh, life is annoying sometimes. George went to visit one of his generals when he soon found out that the general was a traitor and was on his way to England to tell England all of America's secrets. You should know him. His name was Benedict Arnold. George won his last battle of the Revolutionary War 3 years later. George commanded his men to play an old nursery rhyme called "If the World Went Upside Down at the Surrender." The British surrendered only 3 years after the French joined. All the Americans needed was that little French boost. The first thing that needed to happen now was to put someone in charge, and everybody knew who that would be. If you haven't figured it out yet, here's a little secret. It's George Washington. One day, George got a letter asking him if he would like to be King George of the United States of America. George said, "Yes, I would love to." Just kidding! George was horrified. He told the Congress right away that America didn't need another king. It needed a President George. He didn't even want to be in politics. Well, the Congress voted who should be the first president. And that was him. They chose George, so unhappily he packed up and moved to New York so he could be inaugurated. George had something to grieve about there too. His mother died at the age of 80. He pushed that to the side of his mind and focused on the matter at hand. He had to focus on not going to war to the French because they were in a revolution too. He went for another term reluctantly. When George said, "I'm done with this whole president thing," the whole world was amazed. How could he give up all that power? This was the first time in history it had ever happened. George handed all the power to John Adams. P.S. He's in my next video. Wink, wink. He got home to Mount Vernon, and he was eager to go out on his horse back through the woods to get some stuff off his mind. When he got back, he said he had a cold and he had a sore throat. So Martha, his wife, asked if she should send for the doctor. George said, No, it's just a cold." In the middle of the night, though, he woke up having a hard time breathing, so the doctor came quickly. By the time it was in the morning the doctor had bled George 6 times and had given him pills to make him throw up. His last words were, "'Tis well." He took his last breath on December 14, 1799, at 10 p.m. George Washington was an amazing man. He was one of the greatest and wisest men that ever lived. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you later.